والصلاة والسلام على النبي الكريم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, today we are going to very briefly go through a few issues related to Palestine in light of what's been going on over the past 1.5 months. A lot of questions have come up in our community because of what's going on. And essentially I want to address 3 questions in today's presentation. The first is the claim that the Palestinians are being punished for their sins. Right? This is a claim that has been made by some people in our community, that the Palestinians are being punished for their sins. I want to address that claim with the Quran and Sunnah. The second is the claim that protests or boycotts are haram. Right? Protests and boycotts, some people are claiming that these things are haram. You know, there was a very viral video on TikTok and Twitter and Instagram of a da'i in Dubai telling people that boycotts are haram without permission of the ruler. I want to get into that a bit, right? And explain the fiqh perspective on that. So just give you some idea of how we're going to approach this. This is an academic discussion. The idea here is to look at what does the Quran say, what does the Hadith say, where does the usul al-fiqh take us, and whatever it arrives at, we accept. Right? So an important point, fiqh is not always what you want it to be. Maybe you want something to be halal but it's haram. Maybe you want something to be haram but it's halal. Fiqh is not based on our opinions. We go where the evidence goes. So we need to approach these topics academically and not emotionally. I say this because Palestine is a very emotional issue. Right? People get very heated up and very emotional on this issue. So today I want us to address it from the perspective of what does the Quran say, what does the Hadith say, where does the usul al-fiqh take us, and from there we can discuss strategy and things. But it's very important when we discuss fiqh that we keep emotion out of it. To me, this has become one of the big problems in this age, that fiqh discussions have become very emotional. And people get upset if a fiqh ruling is not what they want it to be. Right? So I want us to separate emotions from fiqh. And let's discuss it purely in terms of what does the evidence lead to. I'm not going to go into what do I think about what's going on in Palestine and what the Zionist regime are doing. I gave many lectures on this, right? You've heard me talk about this many times. It's very obvious where I stand on this issue. And today I just want to discuss these specific points. The other issues we've covered in my Jummah khutbahs and in other presentations in the past. And inshallah, I'll go to the full presentation. If there's any questions, we'll deal with it at the end. So let's jump into the first issue. So we know that militarily, the Palestinians seem to have been on the losing end for decades now, right? And some of the local people, I don't want to put any specific boxes there, but some people in our locality have been saying that Allah is punishing them for their sins, right? One of them went as far as to say that Israel is the army of Allah. So I want to address this from the Quran and Sunnah. Is military defeat a punishment from Allah? Before I go into what the Quran and Sunnah says, what do you all think? No. Right? And let's just start off with a very simple story. In the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he sent a letter to the Emperor of Rome calling him to Islam. And the Emperor of Rome, he calls Abu Sufyan to his palace to discuss this letter and to learn about this prophet. Interesting side point, where does this conversation take place between Abu Sufyan and Heraclius? In which city? Jerusalem. It takes place in Jerusalem. Heraclius is in Jerusalem. At that time, it's called Ilia Constantinia, right? Because it was a Roman city, right? That's why the hadith says he was in the city of Ilia. Ilia was the name of Jerusalem at that time. So he was in Jerusalem when he had a dream about the Prophet ﷺ, and then he receives this letter. Abu Sufyan just happens to be in town for business, so he calls him in and he asks him a series of questions to prove that this is a true prophet. I just want us to focus on one question. Right? It's a very beautiful hadith. I did a whole khutbah on it before. But just one question. Heraclius asked Abu Sufyan, have you ever faced him in war? He said, yes. Asked, who wins? He said, sometimes he wins, sometimes we win. What was Heraclius' reply? He said, that is the case of the prophets. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. Think about this, right? Heraclius, the emperor of Rome, saw the idea of a prophet losing a battle as a sign of him being a true prophet. Why? Look at the history of prophethood. Not all of the prophets became kings. Not all of the prophets conquered land. Many of them were killed. Many of them had 0 followers and they were killed by the people. Right? And so I want us to start from that point. If the prophets of Allah losing battles and being killed by their people does not mean that they were in any ways losers. It means that they were still successful in doing their job. So where does this idea come from that if someone loses in dunya that means they are being punished? Where does the idea come from? Because that's not the way we look at these stories of the past, right? So we begin by, I want to mention a few points to refute this. Number one, Allah promised to test us, right? Allah says He will test us with naqsim min al-amwali wal-anfuthi wal-thamarat, that we will lose lives and wealth and efforts. We will lose lives, wealth and efforts. He said you will lose. And He still said, فَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, give good news to those who have sabr when they lose. And then He said, those who say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. So Allah is saying that you will be tested with losing. People will die. People will lose money. People's efforts will be in vain. But if you have sabr with that and you say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, you win, you go to Jannah. Right? So the Quran never tells us that if you become a Muslim, if you worship Allah, if you become pious, you will always win. This is not the message of the Quran. Nor is it the message of the Sunnah. Rather, sometimes we win and sometimes we lose, as Heraclius told Abu Sufyan. Sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. Right? Even in the Seerah, we know Rasulullah ﷺ and the Sahaba, some of the scholars consider Uhud to be a defeat. Right? There's difference of opinion whether they counted a defeat or not. But for example, Taif, they didn't conquer Taif. They had to besiege Taif for days and days and days, and eventually they went back. Right? Taif a few months later would convert to Islam, but the actual battle did not end with the Muslims conquering it. So military losses and victories do not indicate whether whether Allah is pleased with someone or not. Another proof for this from the Quran, in the battle of Uhud, when the rumor was spread that Rasulullah ﷺ had been killed, what did Allah reveal? He said, Muhammad is just a messenger. Messengers have been killed before him. If he dies or is killed, will you run away? He said, messengers have been killed before him. Right? That's not mean that there was something wrong with the messenger. No. So the messengers can lose. Furthermore, Rasulullah ﷺ told us the people who are tested most severely in this world are those who are closest to Allah. Those who are closest to Allah. So this is why it irritates me. Someone who is living a life of luxury in South Africa, someone with upper middle class luxury life in South Africa, looks at people who are being tested in Palestine and says Allah is punishing them for their sins. As if he is pious and that's why he's getting his dunya. So in our religion, material success does not equal the pleasure of Allah. Material loss does not equal the anger of Allah. These are two separate issues. A righteous person can be wealthy, a righteous person can be poor. A righteous person can win a battle, a righteous person can lose a battle. These things have nothing to do with whether Allah is pleased with you or not. And this idea that if Allah is pleased with you, you're definitely going to win, this has no place in our religion. Right? This is not a guarantee that because you are a Muslim, you're definitely going to win. Rather, we know in this dunya, many of the prophets did not attain success in terms of dunya success. They attained success in the akhirah. Many of the righteous people throughout history, including many of the Sahaba, they did not attain worldly success. If you look at the story of Mus'ab ibn Umayr, he was born into wealth and luxury. He is martyred in the battle of Uhud as a poor man. He doesn't live to see the conquest of Makkah. He doesn't live to see the expansion of Islam. But his martyrdom is his success. His martyrdom is his success. And we need to look at the people of Palestine in the same light. Their martyrdom is their success. They are like the Mus'ab ibn Umayrs of our time. And we also have to remember historically, and a lot of people have a romanticized version of history. Reality is, in our history, sometimes we won, sometimes we lost. Muslims once ruled Spain for 700 years. Eventually, Spain became a Christian land again. Muslims ruled India for a long time. Right? We no longer control that region. We know the history of colonization. How many Muslim lands were colonized by the British and the French? Many. Does that necessarily mean that Allah was pleased with the British and the French, or Allah was upset with the Muslims of that land? No, it was a test for the people of that time. If we look at the people who were fighting them, many of them were people who we look to today as awliya, as martyrs, as great heroes of Islam. Right? The people fighting them were not sinners. These were very pious people. Very pious people from our history, but they still lost the battle. If we study specifically the colonization of North Africa, many of the people who fought back against colonization in North Africa, many of the leaders of the armies of the Muslims who fought back were Sufi sheikhs, very pious Sufi sheikhs. Right? They were known for their piety even by their enemies. But many of them were martyred. That doesn't mean Allah was punishing them for their sins. It means that their success was in the Akhirah. So Muslims have lost. Muslims lost World War I. We still, literally what's happening in Israel and Palestine is literally still the aftermath of World War I. It's literally dragging out for 100 years. We are still living through the aftermath of World War I. Because the Zionists assisted the British in World War I in exchange for that land. That was the deal. That's what's going on. It's been going on for 100 years. But despite this, the Ummah still continues. Despite every loss that the Ummah has been through, we are still the fastest growing religion. We are still a religion that is being revived. We are still seeing Islam being revived in almost every country around the world. We are seeing thousands of people converting to Islam. We are seeing Muslims who are growing in almost every field. Muslims are growing successful. This is despite the losses, despite everything that happened, especially over the past 200 years. So we have to understand that whatever happens in dunya is part of Allah's broader plan for us. And sometimes a loss is part of Allah's broader plan. Sometimes it's simply a way of Allah to take people as shuhada, as martyrs, so that all their sins are forgiven and they go straight to Jannah. Sometimes it's a means of converting somebody else to Islam. That somebody who is not interested in Islam at all, they see the iman of the Muslim, they see the tawakkul of the Muslims, they witness true faith in these Muslims going through these difficulties, and because of that they become Muslim. So Allah uses the martyrdom of one person to be a means of guidance for somebody else. We have to look at everything in the broader picture that Allah knows and we do not know. But most importantly, when we follow Islam, we are not guaranteed worldly success. And that's not what we call success. Rather, success is Jannah. That is success, getting to Jannah. So I want us to take a look at 3 verses of the Quran related to this. The first one, I think it was 2, not 3. Right? The first one, Surah Al Imran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in verse 26 of Surah Al Imran, قُلِ اللَّهُمَّ مَالِكُ الْمُلْكِ تُؤْتِي الْمُلْكَ مَنْ تَشَاءُ وَتَنْزِعُ الْمُلْكَ مِمَّنْ تَشَاءُ. You say, O Allah, the King of Kings, you give kingdom to whom you will, and you take the kingdom away from whom you will. وَتُعِزُّ مَنْ تَشَاءُ وَتُذِلُّ مَنْ تَشَاءُ. You give honor to whom you will, you give humility to whom you will. بِيَدِكَ الْخَيْرِ. All good is in your hands. إِنَّكَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. You have power over all things. Now in the tafsir of the first half of this verse, you give kingdom to whom you will and you take it away from whom you will. Read the tafsir of this verse. Firstly, Allah doesn't say He gives kingdom to the righteous and takes it away from the sinners. So He gives it to whom He wills, He takes it away from whom He wills. Right? We know some of the Sahaba lived to a time where they were tyrant kings. The tyrants were the rulers and the Sahaba suffered under those rulers. Right? That doesn't mean that Allah gave kingdom to those people so they must be pious. No, sometimes even when the community is righteous, their ruler might be a tyrant and they test to them. Rather, what you will find in the books of tafsir is that leadership and authority is something that goes through cycles. It is something that passes from one empire to another. Everyone has their time in the spotlight, right? The Arab Muslims for over 600 to 700 years were in that spotlight with the Umayyad and the Abbasid empires. Then the Turkish Muslims were in that spotlight for 700 years with the Ottoman Empire. And now it's time for some of the disbelievers to be in that spotlight, to have that power and authority. But Allah takes it away. Allah gives it to whom He wills. And each person is tested. Whoever is put into a position of authority, they are being tested with that position of authority. Right? Whether they are Muslim or not, they will be answerable to Allah on the Day of Judgment for any injustice that they did. So this verse teaches us that Allah rotates the kingdoms and leadership amongst people, and this is not a sign of that Allah being pleased with someone or not. The other example from the Quran, and we'll end this topic on this point and move on to the other topic, is Surah Buruj. What is Surah Buruj? Surah Buruj is the story of the boy and the king. If you don't know the story of the boy and the king, look it up. You can read it in the tafsir of Surah Buruj, in tafsir Ibn Kasir, or you can find it in Sahih Muslim. It's a very long story, right? There's even an animated movie about it. If you go on YouTube and type in the boy and the king, there's a full 1.5 hour animated movie about it. It's a very famous story. And basically in this story, at the end of the story, this boy who was like the only believer in the city, because he is killed by the king, the entire city converts to the truth, and then the king does a genocide. He kills the entire city. He kills every single believer. So in this story that the Quran mentions, the believers were all massacred. Not a single one survived. A complete genocide. But how did Allah end the story? He says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ لَهُمْ جَنَّاتٌ تَجْرِي مِنْ تَحْتِهَا الْأَنْهَارُ ذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْكَبِيرُ. Those who believe and do righteous deeds will have gardens beneath which rivers flow, and that is the true victory. That is the great victory. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us a story in the Quran where literally a tyrant ruler does a massacre, a genocide of an entire Muslim population. But Allah tells us that population are the ones who are successful. Why? Because they end up in eternal paradise and that king ends up in the eternal hellfire. So in the long run, who is the one who is successful? So the main point here is that worldly success and loss has nothing to do with piety. It is all part of the bigger plan of Allah. It is very possible that righteous people may lose in this dunya. Whether it's in business, whether it's in politics, whether it's in war. It is possible that a righteous person will lose. And it's very possible that a tyrant will win. And that a bad person will win. That's why we have a day of judgment. Right? On the day of judgment, that's when justice will be done between these people. Right? If the good guys always won, there wouldn't be a need for the day of judgment. Right? So in our religion, we don't have the sense that, oh, somebody lost, Allah must be punishing them. They must have done something wrong. No. Sometimes that loss is simply loss of wealth and family, right? A loss of lives and wealth, as mentioned in Surah Baqarah. And it's a test of sabr. That's what it is. Moving on to our second topic, the fiqh of boycotts and protests. So, there are two groups of people who are saying that boycotts and protests are haram. Two groups of people, right? One group are apolitical. They don't like to get involved in politics. So anything that has a bit of a political slant to it, they find some way to say it's haram, right? Because they want to stay out of it. The other group, more dangerous, they're part of a government-sponsored movement in the Muslim world to basically get people to just obey the government without question, right? And to do that, they need to make sure that they never say a thing against what the government says. And so this movement and pushing this idea, you can't protest, you can't boycott, just listen to what the government says. And we'll come to that a bit later. So let's get into the actual fiqh. Is it haram to boycott something or to protest? And the answer is very simple, right? Very simple. In Islam, everything is halal until proven otherwise. That's our principle. When it comes to matters of this world, things are halal until proven otherwise. If someone tells you that something is haram, they must bring clear evidence. And I cannot think of any evidence in the Quran or in the Hadith that says that it's haram to boycott someone or that it's haram to protest. In fact, I can find plenty of evidence for the opposite. Right? So if you look at the concept of boycotts, how do you prevent somebody from boycotting? Let's think realistically, right? Just say, I want to boycott one company. Can you stop me from boycotting? How would you do that? If I just say, I'm not going to buy this company's products anymore, how would you stop someone from doing that? Can you force them to buy something? You can't. What's the number one principle of business in Islam, for a business deal to be valid? Allah says in the Quran, for a business deal to be valid, there must be taradin bainahum. There must be mutual consent. Both the buyer and the seller must consent. Meaning you cannot force someone to buy something, you cannot force someone to sell something. So if someone decides, I'm not buying from anyone, I'm not buying from this person, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't force somebody to buy from somebody else. Right? There were boycotts even at the time of the Prophet ﷺ from both sides. We know the Quraysh boycotted the Muslims, right? But we also know when Ka'b ibn Malik did not go for the Battle of Tabuk, him and the two others who did not have an excuse, the Muslims boycotted them until the verses of the Quran were revealed that Allah has forgiven them. Right? We also know that there was a chief of another tribe who converted to Islam and he started a financial boycott against Makkah. Right, where he stopped sending food to Makkah and they relied on him for grain. He did this as a way of protesting against them for oppressing the Muslims. Right? And he didn't ask Rasulullah for permission to do this. He understood that, unless there's some evidence that it's haram, I can do this. So he stopped doing business with them. But there's also proof that you don't have to boycott. That's the other thing. Right? We'll come to that a bit later. And that's the other part. You can't say boycotts are haram, but technically you can't force it on others as well. And I could not find any evidence that you can force a boycott on others. Right? So what I mean by this is, just say that you are convinced that a certain company is supporting Israel. So you choose not to buy from that company. But your cousin or your brother or your neighbor is not convinced that that company is supporting Israel, or that the boycott's going to make any difference. So he continues to buy their products. What can you do about it? Nothing. Right? Technically, in terms of fiqh, there's nothing you can do about it. And technically, he's allowed to do that, because even when Rasulullah ﷺ and the Sahaba in Medina were dealing with hostilities from the Jews of Medina, they still did business with them. Right? Now, there is a very technical reason why they had to. I think if they had an alternative, they wouldn't have done business with them. But the way the economy of Medina was set up was that the Arabs were the farmers and the Jews ran the marketplace. So if you needed to buy anything from the marketplace, you had to buy it from the Jews. Right? So they didn't have an alternative. So they continued to do business with them while they were at war with them. And sometimes we may find ourselves in that situation. There may be certain products where every single producer is a Zionist, right? Or think of another example, Chinese products. All of us want to boycott China, but it's impossible, because to a certain extent they control the markets, right? So in that case, what are you going to do? You just have to, you just have to keep buying from them, even though you don't want to. So the point is, you can't force a boycott on others. You can motivate people to, you can encourage people to, you can explain the wisdom and behind it, but there's really no way, even especially since we don't have any political power, there's no way to enforce it, right? The other point I want to make here is that issues like boycotts and protests are not they're not necessarily matters of fiqh. They are more matters of political strategy. Now, one of our problems as a community is we think of everything in terms of, is this haram, is this wajib? That's how we think. We just think in these blocks of fiqh terms. But when you study siyasa, sharia, Islamic politics, there's a lot of politics is not black and white, is this halal or is this haram? Rather, it boils down to what is the most effective strategy to defeat the enemy. That's what it boils down to, right? So whether you should boycott a company or not may really boil down to what are you going to achieve through that boycott. Same with the protest. Whether it's not a matter of halal and haram, it's a matter of what would I achieve through this? Is it going to achieve a goal? And we're going to look at some of those goals. So what this means is that when there is a boycott or a protest, we shouldn't be looking at it from the perspective of, is this halal or haram? No, by default it's halal. Rather, our perspective should be, We weigh the pros, we weigh the cons, we look at the data, we look at the strategic objectives, and we decide, is this a worthy cause? Is this worth doing? Right? That's what we should be looking at. So I want us to move away from just looking at things in terms of just halal and haram, but look deeper, look into things as political strategies. Because we all want to do something for Palestine. This gives us something that we actually have the ability to do. The other point I wanted to make about protests, right? One could argue, I actually believe this is what happened. There's a lot of misunderstandings about the Battle of the Camel. What was the Battle of the Camel? When Osman radiallahu anhu was murdered, Aisha radiallahu anha and Talha and Zubair were upset that nobody had executed the murderers. So they gathered 10,000 people or more and marched to Iraq to demand justice. And a battle broke out between them and the opposing side. They did not march out with the intention of fighting. They did not march out with the intention of fighting. So what was the intention? Why were 10,000 people marching to Iraq if they had no intention to fight? It was technically a protest in modern terms. Right? One of the narrations even says that when Usman was murdered, Aisha radiallahu anha stood in front of the Kaaba and gave basically a motivational speech to people to rally them up to go and do something about the murders of Usman. And then people gathered and they marched, right, to go and demand justice. They marched, 10,000 people marched from Makkah and Medina to Iraq to demand justice. What do we in modern terms call 10,000 people marching to demand justice? We call it a protest. Technically the Sahaba did that, right? I also believe the same to some extent with the story of Hussein radiallahu anhu in Karbala.
Battle of Siffin? Battle of Siffin.
Yeah?
Was that called the Battle of Siffin?
The Battle of Jamal.
Jamal.
Yes, Siffin was the battle that came afterwards, 5 years later.
This was Jamal.
Yes, Jamal. It's called the Battle of Jamal because Aisha was on a camel and the battle ended when the camel was killed. Right? That's when everyone started fighting. So, the same with Hussein and Karbala to me. Hussein and his family had no intention to fight. Right? They were basically saying, we're not supporting this ruler because he's a tyrant. And that ruler's army surrounded his family and massacred him. So basically this was a tyrannic ruler massacring people who were demanding justice. Right? That's what they were doing. They were demanding justice. They didn't have an intention just one small family is going to fight the whole kingdom. Right? That maybe if Hussein had great power then he would have fought, but at that point in time they were a family who were against what the rulers were doing and they were verbally outspoken about it. So there are examples in our history of people who did what we would call protest today. Another example would be, there were some Sahaba who were not happy when Yazid became the Khalifa. And as a way of showing this, they refused to give him the bay'ah. They refused to give him the Pledge of Allegiance. They didn't fight him, they didn't rebel against him, they didn't cause civil unrest and war, but as a form of protest, they refused to give him the bay'ah. And everybody knew this Sahabi didn't give him the bay'ah. And it was a big deal that the Sahaba are refusing to give this man bay'ah. So that's a form of protest, right? That is a form of protest, that you are taking a stand against the ruler to show him that you don't support him. Right? So there is evidence for this in our history, that Muslims did these things. As for those who claim that it is haram, well, the main group talking about this today are a group found in the Arab world who basically they were invented in the 90s to get people to blindly submit to their kings. Right? They came up with this idea that it's haram, it's khuruj, it is rebellion to criticize the ruler. And you have to obey the ruler in everything. And they spread this idea throughout the Arab world to such an extent that now those rulers can do what they want. Right? They can have the most evil of sins taking place in their lands. Can't say anything about it, not allowed to criticize the ruler. So, this isn't coming from the religion, it's coming from a political movement that used the religion to control people. Right? This is a very dangerous political movement that exists in the Muslim world, and through the internet, they have influence now all over the world. So very quickly, I want us to go through a few principles. If anyone tells you protests or boycotts are haram, 3 principles that you can use to prove it otherwise. Number 1, al-aslu fil ashyahi al-ibaha. the default ruling of anything is that it is permissible. This is a maxim of fiqh found in all four madhabs. Right? In usul al-fiqh, they call it al-ibahatul asliya, default permissibility. And the way this rule works is, with the exception of sexual relations and meat, everything else is permissible until proven haram. In the case of sexual relations, it's only permissible within the contracts that Allah has allowed. And in case of meat, it's only permissible when you know the meat is halal. When you have proof that the meat is halal. Like if you just see a steak lying somewhere, the default ruling is that that steak is haram, unless you know that it was slaughtered in a halal way. So when it comes to meat, the default ruling is that it's haram, unless you know that it's halal. Today our halal certificate bodies take care of that for us, right? But you can't just eat meat that you find somewhere. You need to know how it was slaughtered. And same with the relationship between a man and a woman, it's only allowed within those contracts mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah. Anything else in terms of sexual relation between, now we have to say between a man and a woman, or a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, everything else is haram except what is proven to be halal from the Quran and Sunnah. But outside of those two areas, when it comes to things of this world, everything is halal until proven haram. So when someone tells you that something is haram, right? And in our community, there's a lot of things people claim to be haram that's not haram. But if someone tells you this, bring up this principle and tell them that in our religion, according to all four madhabs, things are halal until proven to be haram. So what is the proof that it's haram? And proof isn't my Maulana said so. Right? That's not proof. Proof is Quran or Hadith or Usul al-Fiqh. They need to show you some clear way of proving this to be haram, not just because one person said so. The other principle is that Allah mentions, this is the main principle of business, right? In Surah An-Nisa verse 29, Allah says about business, إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ تِجَارَةً أَن تَرَادٍ مِنْكُمْ. Do not consume each other's wealth unlawfully, but consume it through business, through mutual consent. So, taradim minkum, mutual consent, is considered according to all of the madhabs as one of the pillars of a valid business deal. A business deal is only valid when both the buyer and seller mutually consent. You cannot force someone to buy something, you cannot force someone to sell something. This is a default principle of our religion. So nobody can force you to buy something. So if someone's telling you it's haram to boycott, what do you mean by it's haram to boycott? Are you going to force me to buy that coffee? You're going to force me to buy that burger? How do you stop someone from boycotting? If they don't want to buy, you can't stop them, right? So business is by mutual consent, and therefore you cannot force someone to buy something. If by default, if you force someone to buy something, the sale is invalid. This is again all four madhabs agree upon this. If you force someone to buy something, the sale is invalid. So consent is mentioned in the Quran as one of the pillars by which business is done. And number three, going on that idea today, we have too many people in our community who are quick to call things haram. They just jump at this is haram, that is haram. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, la tuharrimu tayyibati ma ahalla Allahu lakum wa la ta'dadu inna Allah la yuhibbul mu'tadin. O you who believe, do not make haram the good things that Allah has made halal for you. And do not go to extremes. Allah does not love those who go beyond the boundaries. So, in this verse, Allah is prohibiting us from making things haram that He has made halal. And the default is that things are halal. Now, the early scholars, if you read the books of any of the early scholars of fiqh, they would very rarely use the word haram. They would use the word haram only for things on which they were 100% sure that Allah or His Messenger have said that this is haram. Because haram means that Allah has prohibited it. Haram means you can go to Jahannam for this. That's what haram means. So you will find the scholars will say, right, if you read the books of fiqh, the scholars will say, if they're like not 100% sure on the evidence, they will say something like, I don't like it. It's not good. It's better to avoid it. Right? These are the words they would use. They wouldn't use the word haram. So you can say, for example, we can definitely say zina is haram, right? Because that's in the Quran, and we know it's something that leads to Jahannam. You can say murder is haram. It's something in the Quran that leads to Jahannam. But If someone is saying that protests are haram, well, this other guy said boycotts are haram. So you saying that Allah has prohibited me from boycotting Starbucks, and that I will go to Jahannam if I don't buy Starbucks. Because that's what haram means. You can go to Jahannam for doing it. And that's what haram means. If I go for a protest, I'll go to Jahannam. Right? Because haram means there is a potential of you being punished in the hellfire for doing it. Doesn't mean you will be. Allah can forgive people for doing haram. But it means the potential is there. So the early Muslims were very strict on this concept. Do not declare things haram unless you are 100% sure. Unless you've studied all the evidences and you are 100% sure it is haram. At most you can say, I don't like it. It's not good. Muslims should avoid it. But only use the word haram for things that are definitive, not for things that are speculative. Okay, to conclude, I'm just going to go through a few last points on why we boycott and why we protest and some of the side considerations related to this, and then we will close off. So, why do people boycott and why do they protest? And when you look at the why, you'll see that it's something completely halal, right? So we boycott, I would say, for 3 reasons, and we protest for 3 reasons, and there are others as well. Firstly, we may boycott a country or a company to economically hurt the enemy, right? That you want to damage the economy of that country. Now, from what I understand, no matter what boycotts we do against Israel, as long as America is sending them their $1 billion of aid, it's not going to make much difference. But there are other reasons to boycott anyway. But I'm just saying, for this specific case, maybe it would be smarter to boycott America and to get Americans to pressurize their government to stop sending $1 million in aid to Israel. And that's starting to happen. This is the first year where I'm actually seeing this happen. Where Americans are starting to ask, why are we sending these people money when we have so many problems for our own to solve? So maybe that would be a smarter strategy, to put pressure on Americans to stop supporting Israel. Because Israel isn't really thriving off its economy. It's thriving over the fact that no matter how many bombs they drop, America is going to send them more money. Remember that one of the main things that stops people from bombing other countries is the fact that every country has limited resources and bombs cost millions of dollars. So people are very careful. I can't just drop a bomb on someone. But with the Israelis, they know no matter how many millions they spend on bombs, America sends in that $1 billion, and that covers it up 100 times over. Right? So this gives them free rein to do what they want. So economically hurting them through boycotts may be a smarter way is to go towards America for this. And by the way, economically hurting your enemy was a strategy of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is why they raided the caravans of the Quraysh. Now some people think it's, that we need to hide that part of history. But when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba moved to Medina, they started raiding the caravans of the Quraysh. Why? To economically weaken the enemies. This is what led to Badr, right? You were going after the caravan of Abu Sufyan, and he got news and he called the army, and the army came to fight him. But why were they going after the caravans of the Quraysh? Because at that time, that's how you weaken the economy of your enemy. That while the caravans are traveling from one city to the other, it was fair game for the enemies. It was a military strategy of that time for economically weakening your enemy. Today we can use boycotts in this way. Boycotts can also be used to pressurize a company to give up support for an enemy. So maybe financially it wouldn't make a difference, right? But perhaps there's an owner of a company locally who supports Israel. And if everyone stops giving him business, maybe he'll think twice about supporting Israel. You can make a difference like that. You turn one more person against him. Right? That is making a difference. Boycotts can also be done to show moral support for an ally. So for example, there are many local companies that are owned by Zionists that may not even be sending any money to Israel. But maybe just simply out of solidarity with the Palestinian people, we don't support these businesses. Right? To prove a point to them that we can't do much to help the Palestinians. Maybe one of the small things we can do is we don't support the business that supports the enemies. Right? So here we don't expect the boycott to have an economic impact on Israel. But at least it's us taking a stand against locals who are on the wrong side. So these are some of the reasons that people may boycott. For protesting was one of the arguments used against it, saying why it's haram. I don't know how this leads to it being haram, but one of the arguments used against it, why people say it's haram, is they say there's no point to protesting. You're not going to achieve anything. Right? But history has proven that protests do make a difference. In fact, the history of this country proves that boycotts and protests both make a difference. That's how we got to where we are, right? That both boycotts and protests led to the downfall of a party. So it makes a difference. So how does it make a difference? There's three things, and these things can take a long time. Firstly, a protest may bring things to public attention. Maybe that the average person out there doesn't follow the news, or they don't follow the news of the Middle East, so they don't know what's going on in Palestine. When they see a protest, it may bring it to their attention. In many parts of the world, this is what protests did. Number two, protests may change public opinion. And this year we've seen that. We've seen that happen. There have been protests for Palestine all over the world for decades. But this past month was the first time where we saw a large shift in public opinion, where many people who in the past supported Israel are now supporting Palestine. And this means protests do make a difference, right? Because protests are turning public opinion. Step number three, once public opinion turns, then protests become about pressurizing the government to act. Because if you get the majority of the population on the side of the Palestinians, and they are protesting for the Palestinians, people who want their votes, people who want to stay in office, people who want to maintain political power, now need to listen to the majority, right? And protests can then be used to pressurize governments to act. And again, we have seen historically, we've seen this work. We've seen protests work for South Africa. We've seen protests work for the Black Rights Movement in America. We've seen it work all over the world, right? So people who say they don't work, again, perhaps they're just ignorant of history. We'll close off with just a few side points to note. When it comes to what you should or shouldn't boycott, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not an economic expert, and honestly, in our community, there is so much contradictory information on what you should or shouldn't boycott. I don't want to be the one to tell you what you should and shouldn't boycott. I'll simply say this much, that if you are 100% sure that the owner of a certain company supports Zionism, then you should avoid buying from that company, right? And if an expert tells you that boycotting this company can actually make a difference to the American economy or the Zionist economy, or at least to international pressure on these governments to change their policies, then you should consider boycotting those companies. But the reality is, every day different people are sending out different lists of what to boycott, and many of these lists are contradictory, and this becomes a mess. And that takes me to our second point. Be realistic about what you can boycott. In the heat of the moment, when genocides are happening, many of us say we're going to boycott these 300, 400 companies, right? And 2 weeks later, we're back to buying from them. Why? Because the strategy you chose was emotional and unrealistic. What would be more realistic? You choose 3 to 5 companies that you know there are alternatives to, and that you know realistically you can avoid buying from this company for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, right? And you know for sure that these companies either support Israel or they're financially involved with Israel in some way, and so you choose to boycott those countries. So I think a 5-year boycott over 5 specific companies is more productive than just for 2 weeks avoiding 200 companies, right? And really, let's face it, that's what happens to many of us. Every time we see this, something happens in Palestine, people give you a list of 200 companies to boycott. They will shout if you buy from any of those companies, but they themselves are back buying from it 2 weeks later, right? Because this is not a realistic plan. It's not a realistic way to deal with the issue. We need to be realistic and we need to be strategic, right? Even the BDS movement says, if you go to the BDS website and you check on boycotts, they give you the same advice. They say, don't try boycotting everything. Be strategic and be realistic. That's going to have a much better long-term effect on the issue than just being emotional about it. 2 more points about protests. Number 1, make sure we maintain Islamic ethics when we're protesting. So one of the reasons that people bring up why they say protest is haram is they say that people are intermingling and they're flirting and not observing hijab and they're doing vigilante acts of violence. So I'll simply say, don't do all that. Right? That's a separate issue. Those are separate fiqh issues from protests. Go and protest, but avoid anything haram at the protest. Right? These are separate issues. Wherever we are, whatever we're doing, we maintain Islamic boundaries, we maintain Islamic ethics, we maintain Islamic morals. Right? So yes, you're going for a protest. behave in the same Islamic way that you would everywhere else. Personally, I don't think that's a good argument against protest, but there are people who make that argument. And simple solution, go for a protest and avoid anything haram while you're there. It's completely possible to go for a protest and not do anything haram, right? It's completely possible. And number 4, this is something that a lot of people unintentionally fall into, especially today, is that beware of supporting un-Islamic causes through protest, even if unintentionally. So what's happening in the West today is people have this, I went for your protest, so you must come for my protest mindset, right? So it may be that a movement that is supporting something haram, they show up to protest for Palestine, but in return they want you to protest for their rights to do the haram thing, right? You have to be careful here. Now this is a very tricky area to navigate. On one hand, you won't stop anyone from showing up for a protest for Palestine. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that we have to do the same for you.